Imagine yourself in the year 1944. Europe is ablaze. Hitler and his forces are facing an imminent collapse on the Eastern Front, where the Soviets are relentlessly pushing towards the heart of the Reich. But while the Führer concentrates his attention on the Russian steppes, an even greater threat is approaching from the West. For months, the Allies have been secretly preparing an operation that will change the course of world history. This is not just an ordinary attack. It is the invasion Hitler always feared, but never knew exactly when or where it would happen. If you appreciate stories like this, please consider subscribing. Most people who watch are not yet subscribed. In that critical moment, Great Britain had already learned painful lessons about amphibious invasions. In December 1941, British commandos carried out a daring raid on the Vågsøy Islands, off the coast of occupied Norway. The objective was simple, yet crucial: to probe German defences and force Hitler to keep troops in the north, away from other theatres of war. The fish oil factory was destroyed, coastal fortifications exploded in flames, and the commandos withdrew under intense fire. It was a tactical success, but merely a prelude to what was to come. 8 months later, in August 1942, Canadians and British attempted something far more ambitious. The target was Dieppe, a strategic French port. This time, the operation would not just be a reconnaissance raid. It would be a real test of German defences, an opportunity to gain combat experience and perhaps to establish a permanent beachhead. But what transpired at Dieppe would become one of the greatest tragedies of the war for the Allies. As the landing craft approached the main beach, they were met with devastating fire. German machine guns swept the sand, mortars rained down. Those soldiers who managed to reach the beach were immediately pinned down by crossfire. Behind them, supporting tanks became bogged down in the beach shingle, unable to advance. Few managed to scale the seawall. Chaos reigned. Over 3,000 Allied soldiers were killed or captured. It was an absolute catastrophe. Yet from the disaster of Dieppe, a fundamental truth emerged that would shape all Allied strategy. Never, under any circumstances, attempt a direct assault on a German-occupied port. The defences were simply too strong. The Germans had had years to prepare these positions, and they had prepared them well. Churchill understood this profoundly. An invasion of Europe could not be rushed. It would have to be meticulously planned, carefully coordinated, and executed with absolute military precision. But here was the turning point no one expected. In April 1943, at a conference in Washington, Churchill and President Franklin Roosevelt struck a historic agreement. They set a date that would change everything. D-Day, or Operation Overlord, as it was officially named, would take place in the summer of 1944. 6 months. Just 6 months to plan the largest amphibious invasion in history. And while the Allies planned in secret, the Germans were preparing with fierce determination. Since the winter of 1941, Hitler had ordered the construction of a series of fortifications that stretched across the entire European coastline. It was called the Atlantic Wall. Imagine a barrier of concrete, steel and fire extending from Denmark to the Spanish border. Machine gun bunkers were built at every strategic point. Beaches were mined. Barbed wire covered every inch of sand. Obstacles were placed in the waters to destroy landing craft. Hitler boasted, proclaiming he was the greatest builder of fortifications of all time. Perhaps he was right. But not even the Atlantic Wall could be impenetrable if it wasn't adequately defended. And here began the real problem. The European coastline stretched for over 2,000 kilometers. Von Rundstedt, the supreme German commander in the West, had received 15 additional divisions. 15 divisions. It seemed like a lot. But when you distribute those troops along 2,000 kilometers of coastline, suddenly it doesn't seem so impressive. He didn't have enough men to defend everything. He had to make a choice that would determine the fate of hundreds of thousands of soldiers. Von Rundstedt proposed a strategy that made military sense. He would keep a large force of panzers in reserve, positioned northwest of Paris. When the invasion began, he could identify where the Allies were landing and then dispatch this reserve force to crush the beachhead before it could establish itself. It was a rapid response strategy based on flexibility and mobility. But there was one man who profoundly disagreed with this approach. Erwin Rommel was a living legend, the Desert Fox. He had fought the British in North Africa and had personally witnessed the devastating power of Allied air superiority. That experience had left a deep impression on him. Rommel knew that any panzer counterattack would be torn apart by Allied bombers and fighters long before it reached the battlefield. He had inspected the Atlantic Wall and was horrified by what he saw. Many sections were unfinished, the defenses were inadequate. Rommel came to a different conclusion. The panzers, Rommel argued, should be positioned as close as possible to the most likely landing sites. That way, when the invasion began, they could be immediately launched against the Allies, pushing them back into the sea before they established a foothold. It was a strategy of defense in depth, based on immediate containment. Two brilliant generals, two completely different strategies. And Hitler had to choose. Hitler did what Hitler always did. He compromised. He gave von Rundstedt a small reserve force that he could control, but reserved for himself the final right to decide when this force could be used. The rest of the additional troops were scattered along the entire Atlantic seaboard, in accordance with Rommel's wishes. It seemed like a wise solution, but in reality, it was the worst of all possible worlds. There were not enough reserves, there were not enough tanks near the coast. And when D-Day arrived, this indecision would prove costly. But in the autumn of 1943, none of this was clear. Allied planners were facing their own monumental dilemma. Where to land? There were two main options. The first was the Pas de Calais. It was obvious. It offered the shortest sea crossing of the English Channel. It offered the most direct route to Germany. Any military strategist would look at a map and immediately say, Pas de Calais. And that is precisely why General Frederick Morgan, the chief Allied planner, decided to land in Normandy. It was a calculated risk. It was a strategic bluff. Morgan believed the Germans expected the invasion in Pas de Calais, so he would outwit them. He would land in Normandy, a less obvious but still viable location. It was the beginning of a huge gamble upon which the fate of hundreds of thousands of soldiers would depend. But how do you convince the enemy to believe something that isn't true? How do you make a paranoid dictator believe his intuition is wrong? In the autumn of 1943, Allied photo reconnaissance aircraft swept the skies above the beaches of northern France. High-resolution cameras captured every detail, every bunker, every obstacle, every line of barbed wire. The fortifications of the Atlantic Wall were obsessively monitored. French resistance fighters infiltrated the beaches at night, collecting sand samples to test whether armored vehicles could be landed. The coastline of northern France became the most reconnoitered coastline in the history of warfare. Every inch was photographed, analyzed, and studied, but it soon became clear that any landing would require port facilities. The Dieppe disaster had demonstrated that it was impossible to capture a German-occupied port through a direct assault. The Germans had had years to prepare these defenses, so British planners had to be creative. They had to innovate. And that is how one of the most ingenious ideas of the war was born. Giant hollow concrete boxes were constructed in Britain. They could be towed. Once they reached the French coast, they would be sunk to form an artificial harbour. They were known by their codename Mulberries. Imagine that. An entire harbour, built in secret, that could be towed across the English Channel and installed in a matter of hours. It was military engineering at its finest. But there was more. The artificial harbour would be supplied with fuel via a pipeline that would be unwound from enormous reels and laid on the seabed. This pipeline would be 100 miles long, 100 miles of tubing on the ocean floor, and to disguise the pumping station on the Isle of Wight, the British painted it to look like an ice cream parlor. It was absurd. It was brilliant. But the Dieppe disaster had revealed a second, even more urgent problem. How to get the first wave of troops off the beaches and through the German fortifications. How do you move soldiers through barbed wire, trenches, and machine gun bunkers? The man tasked with solving this puzzle was General Percy Hobart, one of the pioneers of armored warfare. Hobart was a creative thinker, a man who did not accept conventional limitations. Hobart developed a series of extraordinary devices. The troops called them the funnies, but there was nothing funny about them. There were flamethrower tanks that could incinerate entire bunkers. There were floating tanks that could navigate to the beach. There were flail tanks with spiked chains that cleared mines. There was the bobbin, a machine that laid firm paths across sand or shingle. There was an armored ramp for climbing seawalls. There was the fascine carrier for tackling ditches. There were bridging tanks for wider obstacles. It was an arsenal of innovation. Each machine was designed to solve a specific problem. Each of them would be crucial to the success of the invasion. But there was still one final problem: how to prevent the Germans from rushing in overwhelming reinforcements before the Allies had established a foothold. How do you keep the enemy guessing until the very last moment? The answer was Operation Bodyguard, a massive and complex deception campaign. German double agents in Britain began sending back to Germany huge amounts of carefully coordinated false information. Everything emphasized that the main landing would be in the Pas de Calais, although a secondary attack might be launched in Normandy. To further muddy the waters, the Allied military created a fictitious army unit. It was called the 1st U.S. Army Group, or FUSAG. It was very obviously stationed in Kent, opposite the Pas de Calais. And who was in command? General George Patton, that pistol-toting American general who had been removed from action in Sicily after slapping shell-shocked soldiers. Patton was rated by the Germans as the Allies' best attacking general. Exactly the kind of man they would expect to command the invasion of Western Europe. Radio transmissions mimicked the wireless traffic of an army. For the benefit of any Luftwaffe reconnaissance aircraft flying over Britain, the fields of Kent were filled with inflatable tanks and carefully faked tracks. There were dummy aircraft made of wood and canvas. Harbours along the Kent coast were filled with dummy landing craft. There were even troops, although these were in reality backup units. It was a theatre of deception on an epic scale. And it worked. The Germans believed it. They were convinced the main attack would come in the Pas de Calais. In December 1943, the Allies appointed American General Dwight Eisenhower as Supreme Allied Commander for the invasion of Europe. It was a wise choice. Eisenhower was a capable strategist, a man who could coordinate the complex operations that lay ahead. British General Bernard Montgomery would be placed in overall command of the initial assault troops. D-Day was set for June 5th, 1944. June 5th, a date that would change history. 2 months before the landing, Eisenhower launched an elaborate air offensive to disrupt German links to the coast. And again, it was carefully planned to give the impression that the Allied target was the Pas de Calais region. As the date of the invasion approached, Allied troop numbers in England reached over 2 million. 2 million soldiers. They were supported by more than 3,000 tanks and 12,000 aircraft. It was an unprecedented invasion force in the history of warfare. The Germans were well aware that an invasion was imminent, but they had been completely taken in by the Allies' phony preparations in Kent. They were convinced that the most likely landing spot was the Pas de Calais. Everything seemed to be going the Allies' way. The troops were briefed on their objectives, then the weather turned against them. Rain lashed down torrentially. Visibility was poor. The English Channel was stormy. But on June 4th, 1944, the assault troops boarded their landing ships. An armada of more than 5,000 vessels set sail, but the rain continued to fall. Later that day, the invasion had to be postponed. The ships returned to port. The assault troops faced a nerve-shredding wait. Early the next morning, the military leadership met again. The naval commanders were keen to proceed. But the air chiefs had doubts. They worried that visibility would still be too poor to provide effective air support. There was palpable tension in the room. Everyone knew that postponing again would mean missing the tidal window. It would mean waiting weeks. It would mean giving the Germans more time to prepare. After a long silence, Eisenhower looked up. "Let's go," he said. Just 2 words. But those 2 words unleashed the largest amphibious invasion ever attempted. Operation Overlord had begun. D-Day had begun. At 1:15 in the morning of June 6, 1944, British aircraft towing gliders arrived over the coast of northern France. Then the gliders were released and plunged down to capture vital bridges over the Caen Canal in eastern Normandy. The Allies had launched their great gamble to invade Hitler's empire in Western Europe. 50 kilometers to the west, American paratroopers descended around the village of Sainte-Mère-Église. There was a fierce firefight. But 3 hours later, the village was in American hands. One of the most crucial battles of World War II was underway. An hour later, horrified German sentries along the Normandy coast saw a vast armada appear out of the mist. They had had no warning. The Allied fleet had sailed under cover of darkness. Moreover, Allied countermeasures had confused German radar into believing the main weight of the attack was approaching the French coast, further east at the Pas de Calais. Allied warships off the Normandy coast now began pounding the German defensive positions. Wave after wave of aircraft swept overhead. Under cover of the bombardment, assault troops headed for the shore, but as they closed in, German artillery and machine guns opened fire. A number of the landing craft were hit. Others fell foul of underwater obstructions. But at 6:30 in the morning, the first waves of troops hit the beaches. At the far western end, the U.S. 4th Infantry Division came ashore near what they called Utah Beach. Within 2 hours, it was linking up with the American paratroopers who had landed at Sainte-Mère-Église. Next door at Omaha Beach, it was more difficult. The beach was a defender's dream with high cliffs and few ways inland. As the U.S. 1st Infantry Division waded ashore, they were mowed down by German machine guns. To make matters worse, the American amphibious tanks were swamped. The troops were trapped on the beach. Disaster was looming. But finally, some of the soldiers managed to scale the cliffs. Against all odds, the Americans held on to the beachhead. Further east, in the center of the landing area, Britain's 50th Infantry Division came ashore at Gold Beach. They too met savage fire. But now, the British deployed their funnies. The troops were soon moving inland. At the adjoining landing spot, Juno Beach, the Canadian 3rd Infantry Division faced a similar situation. Here too, Britain's funnies were vital in helping the troops off the beach. Finally, on the far left flank at Sword Beach, the British 3rd Infantry Division met only patchy resistance. Within hours, its commandos had linked up with the glider-borne troops at the Caen Canal. The timing of the invasion had caught the Germans completely by surprise. They had expected the Allies to wait until the weather cleared. Rommel, the operational German commander for the entire northwest French coast, had taken the opportunity of bad weather to visit his family in Germany. His immediate subordinate in Normandy and Brittany, General Friedrich Dollmann, was over 100 kilometers away, participating in a war game exercise. Only the overall German commander for the whole of Western Europe, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, was at his headquarters. But he needed Hitler's permission to move his panzer reserves to the battlefield. However, Hitler was asleep, and his aides refused to wake him. It wasn't until midday that the Führer finally learned about the invasion, but he didn't take it seriously. He was still convinced that the main attack would come in the Pas-de-Calais. Normandy, he believed, was just a feint. Finally, in the late afternoon, when the scale of the invasion was becoming all too clear, Hitler unleashed his reserves. But they were too far away to provide immediate support. Despite stubborn German resistance, the beachheads around Utah, Gold, Juno and Sword were secure. Only at Omaha was the situation more precarious. Here, German resistance had prevented the U.S. troops from moving more than a mile inland. By nightfall on June 6th, over 100,000 Allied troops had been landed in Normandy. It had been an extraordinary feat of planning, ingenuity, and courage. The first day of the Allies' great gamble had paid off, but it was just the beginning. Now they had to build up, break out, and push on into Europe. As the second day dawned on the greatest seaborne invasion ever attempted, thousands of Allied troops had broken out of their beachheads and were moving inland. But they found the Normandy countryside hard going. The patchwork of woodland and small fields provided ideal terrain for German tanks and machine guns. The Allies suffered heavy casualties. Allied air power provided crucial support. When von Rundstedt's panzer reinforcements arrived, they had been so depleted by the air attacks that they were unable to mount a major counterattack. The German reinforcements were also hampered by French resistance fighters operating behind German lines. They ambushed troop convoys and blew up bridges. As a result, the Das Reich SS Panzer Division took over 2 weeks to make a journey which should have lasted a mere 3 days. Its troops took out their fury on the French civilian population. The village of Oradour-sur-Glane and its 642 inhabitants were completely annihilated. After 4 days of fighting, all the Allied beachheads were finally able to link up. But they had still only managed to penetrate 10 kilometers inland. Eventually, 6 days after the landing, the British commander, General Montgomery, launched a major assault on the strategically important town of Caen. The British 7th Armoured Division, the Desert Rats, advanced, but its spearhead ran into 4 German Tiger tanks. The Allied Sherman tanks were completely outclassed. Their guns were outranged and their shells unable to penetrate the German armor. They were particularly vulnerable because many ran on petrol fuel and were liable to burst into flames when hit. The Germans nicknamed the Sherman the Ronson, after the cigarette lighter, or more macabrely, the Tommy Cooker. In less than 5 minutes, more than 10 British tanks were destroyed. The attack on Caen stalled. Outmatched by the German tanks, the Allies relied on air power and artillery. But it wasn't enough. The Desert Rats retreated. Caen remained in German hands. Meanwhile, further west, U.S. forces advanced on the equally important port of Cherbourg. It would take them nearly 10 days to get close to her. They weren't helped by the weather. During the first week of the invasion, it had been relatively calm and supplies and reinforcements had poured in through the Mulberry artificial harbours. But now, the weather turned. Gales swept the English Channel. The U.S. Mulberry Harbour at Omaha was destroyed. The other Mulberry in the British sector was severely damaged and put out of action for several days. The flow of reinforcements slowed. It meant the port of Cherbourg was an even more vital objective. As the U.S. forces now approached it, the German garrison resisted. There was fierce house-to-house fighting. It would take the Allies a week to secure the city. But the port had been trashed by the fleeing Germans. It would take a further month before it could be brought back into service. Meanwhile, Montgomery launched another assault on Caen. But the storms had turned the fields into a sea of mud. Low cloud meant air support was impossible. To make matters worse, the newly arrived elite German 2nd SS Panzer was thrown into the defense of the city. After 4 days, the British were again forced to hover. Then, as the clouds cleared, nearly 500 Allied bombers devastated Caen. British troops fought their way into the northern suburbs, but the ruins made ideal defensive positions for the Germans. Allied casualties mounted. After 48 hours, the attack was yet again called off. 3 weeks later, Montgomery tried for a fourth time. The plan was to capture the remaining German strongholds and then push on south, deeper into France. After 2 more days of fighting, the city finally fell. The way now seemed open for the British tanks to move south, deeper into France, but the Germans were waiting with a large force of panzers. The British advance stopped again. The Americans in the west, however, were having an easier time. The fighting around Caen had sucked in the majority of the German defenders. As the American forces prepared to thrust further into France, they faced only scattered opposition. The stage was set for the Allied forces to break out at last. At 9:30 in the morning of July 25, 1944, over 1,800 Allied aircraft carpet-bombed a 4-kilometer stretch of the German front line south of Cherbourg. It was the beginning of Operation Cobra, the US breakout into France. The German defenders were stunned by the scale of the assault, but so too were some of the US soldiers. The plan had been for the bombers to fly in from the east parallel to the US front line to minimize the risk of bombing American troops. But most of the aircraft came in over the top of the US lines. Bombs fell short. Over 100 US troops were hit and killed. But despite the ferocity of the bombardment, when the US forces later picked themselves up and moved forward, they found to their astonishment substantial numbers of German troops had survived. The survivors mounted a stubborn resistance. As fighting raged, it looked as though the Americans would fail to break through the German lines. But then, the German defenses crumbled. The next morning, US tanks broke through and moved forward into open country. There was now almost no German resistance left, and the Americans quickly pushed deeper into France. The hill town of Coutances fell, then the crossroads town of Avranches. As the Allies pressed forward, they were helped by change and confusion in the German high command. In early July, 3 weeks after the D-Day landings, Hitler dismissed the German commander-in-chief, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, for defeatism. Von Rundstedt had made little attempt to hide his belief that Germany faced an unwinnable struggle. He was replaced by Field Marshal Günther von Kluge, fresh from the Eastern Front, but with little knowledge of northwestern France. 2 weeks later, Rommel, the second most senior German officer on the front, was severely injured when his staff car was strafed by a British fighter. Then, with the Nazi command already in confusion, there was an assassination attempt on Hitler's life. On July 20th, 1944, a disillusioned aristocratic war hero, Colonel Klaus Schenk, Graf von Stauffenberg, planted a bomb in the planning hut at Hitler's headquarters in East Prussia. 4 officers were killed, but Hitler was sheltered by a heavy, solid oak conference table and escaped with only minor injuries. The plot was swiftly and brutally put down. Von Stauffenberg was shot, and his principal collaborators were put on trial. They would later be hanged. Hitler put a brave face on it and visited some of the wounded in hospital. But it hardened still further his distrust of his senior officers. He would, despite his many earlier misjudgments, demand even greater control over events on the battlefield. Back in France, General George Patton, back in charge of a real fighting force, ordered his troops to fan out. They took Rennes and headed for Laval. They were now moving around behind the German forces, still battling it out with the British and Canadians near Caen. With the Americans to their south and the British to their north, it seemed the German forces in Normandy would be surrounded. Hitler issued his usual order that there should be no retreat. But as the Allies squeezed in on them, the Germans began to flee. They were remorselessly harried by Allied aircraft and artillery. The casualties were appalling. Finally, on August 20th, 1944, the Allied forces moving in from both the north and south met up. The so-called Falaise Gap, named after the nearby French village, had been closed. Large numbers of Germans were trapped. Over 10,000 more Germans caught in the Allied pincers died. A further 50,000 were taken prisoner. The German army in Western Europe was in chaos. Meanwhile, far to the south on the French Mediterranean coast near Cannes, there was a second Allied seaborne invasion. US troops came ashore virtually unopposed. They were helped by paratroopers from the Free French Army, men who had escaped from German-occupied French territory in Europe and North Africa. The landing had always been opposed by the British, who regarded it as a diversion. But the United States had long regarded it as an essential part of clearing the Germans out of France. The troops were greeted by an ecstatic civilian population. It was soon advancing rapidly up the Rhône Valley. Lyon was liberated on September 3, 1944. 10 days later, they reached Dijon and made contact with Patton's forces advancing from western France. German units stationed across the region fled. In barely 3 weeks of headlong advance, the Allied invasion of Europe had liberated most of France. That left Paris, where French resistance fighters now rose up against the German occupation. There seemed little to prevent the Allied onrush from continuing to the German border. History had turned. What began as a desperate gamble on a Norman beach had transformed into an overwhelming victory. The Germans were in flight, their empires were crumbling, and the end, though still distant, was finally in sight. Operation Overlord had changed the course of World War II. It had opened a second front that the Germans could not close. It had liberated millions of people from Nazi oppression, and it had cost hundreds of thousands of lives. But it was necessary. It was essential. And it was ultimately successful. D-Day was not just a day. It was the day the fate of Europe was decided. It was the day liberation began, and it was a day that will never be forgotten. If you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing. Most people who watch are not yet subscribed.